I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the best-selling books The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world. And today is the 6-month anniversary of the attempted coup, the violent attack on the Capitol by seditionist insurrectionists who have yet to be punished. As I've said before, a failed coup is a dress rehearsal. A political party that stages a coup and blocks investigation ultimately wants that coup to succeed. A political party that did not stage a coup, but does not assertively, quickly investigate and prosecute it, also wants that coup to succeed. There is an instigator and there is an accomplice. And after 6 months, if you cannot clearly see the complicity of the accomplice, it's because you do not want to. What kind of a country does not defend itself against an open attack against its own capital, an attack where bombs were spread, and the attackers openly declared their intent was to murder members of Congress? What kind of country does nothing to prosecute a career criminal and Kremlin asset who has been actively and successfully trying to destroy this country from within for personal profit and to appease foreign backers? What kind of country does nothing when its elections are attacked by that same syndicate and when voting rights are destroyed by that syndicate's court appointees? It's the kind of country whose elites do not care if it exists anymore. The behavior of the Democrats acting as accomplices to the Republicans is reminiscent of how Soviet elites behaved in the late 1980s and early 1990s before the collapse of the USSR. They plotted for the aftermath and decided how to divvy up resources. They planned for partition and maximum profit. They covered up massive crimes with facile symbolism and hollow words. The will of the people was irrelevant to them, and ideology was only a mask for power. They did not believe in anything except preserving their own power, wealth, and immunity from prosecution. They sought to live above the economy and above the law, and the way they accomplished that was to become the economy, to become the law. My biggest fear when Biden was proclaimed the nominee is that he was going to be a transitional president as the US moves to full autocracy. I have also long feared that autocracy is, for these criminal elites, a stepping stone to partitioning the United States into smaller, more manageable, autocratic oligarch fiefdoms, a partitioning that criminal elites may see as necessary as the climate crisis ravages land and resources. And so what to do? We're going to get into that. But I'm just going to share a quote. This weekend, I went to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library. To be blunt, it was to see their exhibit on Illinois rock music and teach my children the valuable trajectory from Styx to REO Speedwagon to Richard Marx. But that said, we went to the Lincoln part as well, and I nearly got Andrea a present because all over the gift shop of the Abraham Lincoln Museum was a notebook, and there's a quote from Abraham Lincoln on the cover. And this was the quote: "The probability that we may fail in the struggle ought not to deter us from the support of a cause we believe to be just." And so that is what we need to stick with, is our moral values, our moral clarity, our demands, and no more acquiescence and no more trying to cover up the complicity of accomplices. Call them out for what they are.
There's nothing more thoughtful than getting someone a present than telling someone, I almost got you a present.
I was going to, Andrea, but then I thought I would have to mail it to you. And with Louis DeJoy in charge of the Postal Service, I figured you'd get it sometime after the 2024 election.
Yeah. The joy is coming between us.
Exactly.
Do you still have the George Michael candle that you bought me?
Yes, I do. The one I bought you right before the pandemic.
I would like that immediately.
Yeah, I'll mail that to you.
Overnight that. FedEx, private company, efficiency.
Overnight that. You'll also get that in 2024.
So I appreciate the thought, Sarah. That warms my heart. I accept that as the gift. So Sarah and I throw these shows together. Our outline comes together through the magic of our Twitter direct messages, very last minute, because we both just endure the week in austere silence.
Hell.
And then we produce an outline. And what's really telling, and I want to emphasize for everyone listening, is the fact that each of us, we both observed this week of horror, and we each came to the same conclusion. As like Sarah, I have in my outline for this week's episode a comparison to the Soviet Union. So that the Republican Party, with its free market ideology worship, which is might makes right, deregulation, corruption, an elite cloistered power, an oligarchy, all of that is what the Soviet Union looked like. And that's where Republicans are taking us. So the fact that Sarah and I both came to that same conclusion should tell you that this is where we're headed if we don't stop it. And a really important way we can stop it and fight for our country's future and take our democracy back is by bringing some of the most corrupt elements, including the literal poster childs of this corruption, to justice. And that brings us to Ivanka Trump. We are demanding to know, yet again, why hasn't Ivanka been indicted yet? We had this big news of not only the longtime CFO of Trump Organization, Weaselberg, being indicted, but the Trump Organization itself being indicted in the investigations out of New York State. And we want to make very, very clear that the crimes that Alan Weaselberg has been charged of, the many crimes from fraud, larceny, falsifying records, and so forth, where he faces up to 10 years in prison, around 10 years in prison, Ivanka Trump herself committed crimes of tax fraud. As everybody's chattering about, Rachel Maddow did a big breakdown on this. Last fall, the New York Times reported that Ivanka was paid around $750,000 as a consultant for the hotel projects she was already managing as an executive for the Trump Organization. Donald Trump is notorious for not paying people, but he'll pay his daughter essentially twice as both an executive and as a consultant. So with the big Weaselberg news hitting, I happened to run into an acquaintance who is a tax lawyer for the IRS. She does not work in the criminal division, but I stopped her and had a nice chat. And I asked her about the Weaselberg news and whether Ivanka Trump, in her opinion, committed the same exact tax fraud crime, given the public available reporting. And this tax lawyer acquaintance of mine confirmed why, yes, she did. Absolutely. It's the exact same crime. So we know that Ivanka committed a tax fraud crime. This is in the public domain. It's been reported on by the New York Times. It's out there. It's been out there for months. What Weaselberg got indicted for, in part, Ivanka herself committed that same crime. So why is she still free? Why is her husband, Jared, gearing up to write a book and go on a book tour so he can rehabilitate his image and his wife's image and blame the old man for everything that went wrong and try to escape accountability that way and try to rebuild their image so they can run for office again in some way, shape, or form? So we've known about this tax dodging, right, for a while, and yet Ivanka's still walking free. This matters because nepotism is an effective tool of autocrats and aspiring autocrats because it sends a message that going after family crosses a line. So you better not go after my family, even if they're corrupt. That's what they're saying when they hire their family members, their in-laws around them. And they all do this. Erdogan does this. You have this going on in Russia. Yanukovych, Putin's puppet in Ukraine, did this. And the reason why, say what you will for Hunter Biden, whatever your opinion of the man is, the relentless attacks on Hunter Biden are also a threat, saying, look at how we're destroying the public image of Hunter Biden. Look at how we're harassing Hunter Biden and his family. If you come after my children, we will keep going after Hunter and your family and putting a big fat target on their heads, a big fat public target, and who knows what can happen to them. So all of this nepotism and all of these projected counterattacks on Biden's own children, all of this is being done so the Trumps can avoid accountability yet again. But what does this come back to? The true measure of justice, as we're always saying on the show, is if Ivanka and Jared face any consequences. Remember, Weaselberg and Ivanka are just the tip of the iceberg. The Trump organization runs on a culture of corruption. The leaders of the organization, the Trump family, brought that unchecked corruption to the White House, where it flourished at the cost of countless lives, leaving behind a massive trail of destruction that we're going to be living with for many years to come. So we're asking yet again, why hasn't Ivanka been indicted? Come on, Tish James, the Attorney General of New York State. We are all counting on you here. We know Cy Vance won't do it. He's the product of nepotism himself. His father, Cy Vance Sr., was a renowned American lawyer and the Secretary of State under Carter. Cy Vance Jr. let Ivanka off the hook the first time. If he only had done his job and indicted her for her fraud with Trump, so maybe he could have made his father proud and spared the rest of us from having to suffer under a Trump regime. Think of all the lives Cy Vance Jr. could have saved. What Ivanka did is fraud, plain and simple. NYU professor of taxation Daniel Shaviro, who just came out with a piece in Just Security, where he writes, "This is no mere fringe benefits case. It is a straight out fraud case." He's referring to Weaselberg, but it applies to Ivanka just the same. So again, I just want to point out that from the indictments that are coming out, Vanity Fair dug into them and reported how the Trump organization kept meticulous records of their tax fraud schemes. This is straight up what Yanukovych did, Putin's puppet in Ukraine, who Paul Manafort, Trump's longtime friend and neighbor and campaign chairman, who worked for free in managing Trump's campaign while he happened to have a lot of debt to the Russian mafia, aka Russian oligarchs, aka the Russian state. So Paul Manafort's longtime client, Yanukovych, the Trump of Ukraine, he also kept meticulous records of his off-the-book payments, including millions of dollars to Manafort. This became known as the Black Ledger story. It came out in the New York Times. It was driven by a reformist candidate, a reformist member of parliament in Ukraine, who also happened to be an investigative journalist, who happened to be an active leader in Ukraine's revolution movement of Euromaidan. I want to just emphasize this, that the Trump organization and Putin's puppet in Ukraine both kept meticulous records of their off-the-book payments of their tax fraud schemes. As we mentioned, Weaselberg faces now 10 years in prison. What about Donald Trump? What about Ivanka Trump? Are they too big to fail? Remember, Ivanka Trump stood beside her father as they waited for the January 6th rally to start. Ivanka Trump, in a since-deleted tweet, called the white domestic terrorists patriots that day as they began their siege on the Capitol. She, of course, is calling them to stand down and not be violent, but she referred to them as American patriots. The Trump family built a cult of loyal followers they can incite to violence and wield that cult like a weapon against their political opponents and treat it like a moat around their castle of ill-gotten wealth and impunity. This is straight up a mafia family. The mafia uses violence, threats, and intimidation this way. So what will law enforcement across our country do? Will they stand up to the Trump mafia? Or will government officials see what the Trump family has done to election workers across the country and think, I don't get paid enough to deal with that. I don't want to put my family in danger. And will they back away? The Trumps know what they're doing and they do it well, which is why it works and keeps working. This is a time, unfortunately, of personal sacrifice. If we don't act now, the personal sacrifice required of us will be even greater. Just look at the protesters in Russia and Belarus. So if you want to know if American law enforcement has what it takes to stand up to the mafia-level corruption and tactics of the Trump family, watch if Ivanka gets indicted. If she doesn't, then we're all in trouble, and the men and women who should be protecting us are once again failing to do so.
This episode of Gaslit Nation is sponsored by Talkspace. The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. It's important to find the support you need to face those feelings and move forward. The Talkspace app makes it easy to connect with your licensed therapist on your schedule without having to wait weeks before your next appointment. You can go anywhere and take your therapist with you. With Talkspace, you can send and receive unlimited messages with your dedicated therapist in the app and schedule live video sessions from anywhere. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code Gaslit. That's $100 off when you use code Gaslit at Talkspace.com. Trump has been using the entire time he was in the presidency this excuse, that the chief executive is by definition above the law, that he can't be indicted, using the OLC memo, getting his lackeys, everybody from Mueller to Barr to various other governmental officials to say, yes, we can't prosecute him. And now they're going back to a defense that relies on utterly outdated norms of, okay, he's not the president anymore. He's a private citizen and we still can't prosecute him. And we're in fact going to defend him in personal lawsuits, like say for rape. That is the Merrick Garland DOJ position on Trump. The, cumulative effect of that is, as Andrea just said, confirmation that we're living in a mafia state. But what's worse here is, we're living in a mafia state where people who, either were elected themselves or were appointed to be in positions of power by those who we voted for. Like we voted for Joe Biden. Joe Biden appointed Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland is defending Donald Trump. It's voluntary submission. It's holding up this deeply rotted and corrupt institution. And that's why just everything about, the Allen Weisselberg case, like, I don't know. I read the coverage and I'm just rolling my eyes because of the declining standards of expectations which people create in order to fulfill their own fantasies of what is going on in our criminal justice system as it has to do with white collar crime and with organized crime and with this nexus of it in our government that revolves around the Trump family. The Weisselberg indictment reminded me a great deal, honestly, of the Manafort indictment. So it's appropriate, you brought that up, Black Ledgers Matter or whatever. But anyway, the thing that reminded me of it most was that the indictment covers the years 2005 to 2017, which again, just like Manafort, this is scratching the surface of decades and decades of organized crime and criminal infiltrations and front organizations and people like Weisselberg who just sort of sit in the background and, keep the records, people like Manafort that function as dark arts operatives, and then there's a front man and a showman in the spotlight, and that's Trump. And then, of course, the scope of the indictment is also quite limited. It's about, off the books taxes, a refusal to pay the full amount of taxes. I think it is unlikely he's going to face prosecution. I kind of wonder about the photos of him in which his hands are behind his back as if he's having a perp walk, but you can see that he's not handcuffed, that they're just kind of, he's literally holding his own handcuffs in his hands, which to me is just this incredible symbolism of what the Trump crime cult is. It's like they hold the handcuffs of justice. They hold the power of the law in their own hands to bend it and manipulate it towards their own corrupt, nefarious aims. And as the decades went on, this became more and more ingrained into the broader American politics. Like it started smaller in New York City, but, Trump spread out throughout the 80s. He came out, to the area of the country where I live, places in the Midwest, like he had partners like Carl Icahn bankrupting, cities in Indiana, buying out TWA here in St. Louis, all these dirty deals were happening. It's part of the broader Wall Street takeover of the American economy and of small businesses and of the infiltration or collaboration, really, of Wall Street and organized crime. And the Trump organization is just a prime example of that. And the fact that it took this long that it is now 2021 and Weisselberg has been working for Trump since the 70s and Trump has been committing crimes since the 70s. Again, this reminds me of Manafort, who had begun his crime spree, at the least in the early 80s. The same is true, of course, of Roger Stone, and others who Trump went on to pardon. But yeah, to your point that the litmus test of whether we live in an entrenched mafia state is whether Ivanka and Jared Kushner are indicted. That still stands, and I'm honestly more worried about Kushner because I feel like with Ivanka, there's still this perception of, the president's daughter who worked on the coronavirus task force team that led to the deaths of 500,000 Americans, the president's daughter, who helped create and cover up at points the existence of migrant torture and abuse camps aimed at children, the president's daughter who backed violent white supremacists, on and on. I mean, she was an employee of the White House. She was a key advisor of the president. She should not be treated with kid gloves.
Ivanka Trump represented America on the global stage.
Yeah.
Sitting next to Merkel,
like
other
anyone
world
else.
leaders. Yeah, it was Ivanka, Jared, and Donald Trump. They were together, the unholy trinity, the de facto president of the United States, those three.
Yeah.
And that was the heart of the Trump campaign. It was Ivanka and Jared who said, yeah, let's have Paul Manafort be the campaign chair, run the campaign.
Yeah. And the difference, though, is that with Trump, even though it is not a legitimate excuse, you hear the excuse of, the American people elected him. He was the president. He held the office. Ivanka and Jared were inserted into that office illegally. It broke nepotism laws. It broke security clearance laws. Like, they could have removed Jared Kushner and Ivanka both for lying on their security clearance forms. Jared Kushner is the record breaker, like literally in American history, for lying on that clearance form. All they had to do to get rid of him was get him on that. And then you could have pulled him out. And what kind of country would we have had? What kind of foreign affairs situation would we have now in the Middle East? What kind of reaction to the coronavirus would we have had? Who would have been appointed to various positions? I mean, you could really trace so many of the most malicious and anti-American and corrupt actions of that administration to Jared Kushner. And believe me, there's a lot of competition here. Like, there's Steve Bannon, there's Michael Flynn, there's Bill Barr. There are a lot of, some of the worst Americans, of my lifetime. We're all working in that White House simultaneously. Kushner still wins, and yet he is treated as immune. He is currently working, in fact, with the Democratic Party. He is partnering with Haim Saban, who is one of the leading Democratic donors. And Haim Saban, of course, we've referenced him because Pelosi, back in late 2018, had this very cavalier public conversation with Haim Saban where she said, if our capital crumbles to the ground, our foremost priority is going to be Israel. And, that's a slight paraphrase. We'll post the video in our show notes. We've played this clip on the show before for those who don't think it's real, because of course, then the capital did crumble. And her priority was indeed Israel. And Haim Saban was an enthusiastic proponent of that way of, thinking about America and what's important and who to protect. I mean, I found it frightening and baffling at the time because to me, the Capitol crumbling is a terrifying and horrifying prospect. At the time in 2018, it brought to mind 9/11. And so when there's a terrorist attack or any kind of attack on my country, like, my instinct is to want to protect people. It's to want to protect all fellow Americans. It's to want to protect our national security, our public safety, certainly not to laugh about it from a donor, and certainly not to pledge allegiance to a foreign country. And here the matter is not quite so much that it's Israel, but that it could have been any foreign country she could have inserted in that sentence, and it would have been a horrifying sentence. But anyway, back to Kushner. That's what Kushner is doing now. He's writing a book. He's working with Democratic Party donors who define themselves, as Haim Saban does, as one-issue donors, with the issue being Israel. I have a feeling he's probably, working with his old, family friend, Benjamin Netanyahu, because the Kushners and the Netanyahus go back multiple generations.
And Netanyahu suddenly has a lot of free time on his hands.
A lot of free time. And so we're in this weird situation where, yes, Israel got rid, finally, of their worst worst kleptocratic, mobbed up node in this syndicate. I do not like their new prime minister, Naftali Bennett, because of his policies towards Palestinians, but it's sort of like replacing Trump with Mike Pence. You're just getting a different kind of person with a different kind of network. And so, yes, there were protests against Netanyahu for over half a year for very good reason. And it's good that he's out, but I don't trust that he's gone away. The same way I don't trust that Manafort's gone away. We know Flynn hasn't gone away because he's calling for like coup two, return of the coup. We know Steve Bannon hasn't gone away because he's out there peddling conspiracy theories on the internet. None of these people have been held accountable. They all seem to be viewed as untouchable. They are treated as untouchable. And so for the focus to be so excessively on Weisselberg, it's like people are not seeing the big picture here. And the big picture is a mafia state. Like, folks need to just confront that. Like, I wish that our politicians would use that language. And yes, I know it's terrifying language. It brings to mind visions of countries like, Putin's Russia or, maybe Erdogan's Turkey, of deep, deep entrenched corruption and rot, with our national security agencies that are supposed to protect us being either complicit or complacent or just completely, sucking at their job. I mean, like the Capitol coup is a prime example because everyone announced they were doing it in advance. And we all knew it. As we've said many times, we announced in advance we're having a post-Capitol attack special because they were all like on Twitter saying it. And then yet we have this befuddled FBI who was like, my goodness, who in the world could have seen this coming? Like, it's gaslighting. It's beyond trolling because the national security ramifications are so profound. It's deeply disturbing. And we cannot have, Joe Biden out like licking ice cream cones or whatever the hell he's doing, tweeting platitudes about America being back, when we can all see these elite criminal operatives who are not like randos off the street, but some of the wealthiest and most powerful and most connected people in the world just running free with not even a hint of accountability around the bend, never having to pay for those crimes, never having to pay for the death that they caused in this country, the mass death that happened as a result of how they handled the coronavirus. It did not have to be this way, and we have all seen that. And, it's disturbing. That to me is a sign of like incredible infiltration of our institutional bodies and complicity from within them on a national level.
Without question. So let's move on to the United States of Exxon. There was a must-watch viral video on how Exxon lobbyists, one current, one former, I believe, they have the Republican Party in their pocket. They're allied with the Republican Party. They're one and the same, but they're targeting the big foils to democracy, Manchin and Sinema, among other moderate Democrats like Senator Tester. And they seem to be very friendly with close Biden friend, Senator Coons of Delaware, who joined Sinema and Manchin in voting down the $15 minimum wage. So I think it's really important for us to play a clip of this video, for people to watch this video. You can find it in the show notes for this episode, because it's so essential that all of us ground ourselves in the fact that the politicians in Washington, and I know that sounds very underground radio.
You're like Christian Slater. You're very pump up the volume.
Yes, but they really are built to be the rodeo clowns. They're the bouncing clowns. They're narcissistic. They love the glamour. They love the excitement. They love the TV-ready makeup of being senators in the marbled halls of Washington. And they have enough narcissism in their personality to take on that role where they take all the heat. They get all the attention. They get all the notoriety. They get all the press coverage. They get all the reporters following them around. They get all the fancy invites. They get all the lecture invites. They get all the book deals and book tours and cable news appearances. Meanwhile, the executives pulling their strings, like the executives at Exxon, they get to be private in the background, enjoy their lavish lifestyles in private with their families. They're cloistered away. They don't have to deal with that heat. They don't have to take that heat. They may not be programmed personality-wise to endure that heat, but the politicians who represent their interests and fight for and further their interests in Washington are programmed that way. And when we're talking about Manchin and oh so flamboyant cinema. And so it's important that we understand that the politicians, whether it's Trump, Manchin, or Sinema that we're up against, are just the bouncing clowns. And they have behind them much darker forces who are the real enemy. The real enemy. To emphasize this real enemy, we're going to play a clip of this video. The full video is 10 minutes long. We're just going to play around 2 minutes of it. The whole thing is absolutely worth watching because everyone needs to understand this is really what we're up against. If you wonder why Biden is breaking all his campaign promises, it's because of Exxon. It's because of Exxon's dark money shadow lobbying campaign. It's because Exxon, by their own lobbyist admission, is on the phone with Joe Manchin every week. That is why we're not getting the Joe Biden we were promised on the campaign trail. So we're going to play a clip from this now. It was produced by Unearthed, which is the investigative journalism arm of the big climate activist group Greenpeace, which I've supported over the years through donations. I'm happy to do it. And so we'll play this clip now.
ExxonMobil is so powerful that the management suite at its global headquarters is known as the God Pod. Until recently, it was the biggest, richest corporation in the history of the world. For decades, critics have claimed Exxon deploys cynical, aggressive lobbying techniques to pull the strings of government while running clandestine campaigns to block action on climate change, discredit its opponents, and distract attention from its polluting activities. But not one of its serving senior executives has ever come clean about the Exxon playbook, until now. Here's what Dan Easley and Keith McCoy told us. Mr. McCoy revealed that behind the scenes, the company has been working hard to undermine President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan. The White House proposal included spending hundreds of billions on clean energy and transport as part of the most ambitious clean energy legislation ever proposed by a U.S. president. And it would have been paid for by higher taxes on corporations like Exxon. But these ambitious proposals are on the verge of being defeated. According to Mr. McCoy, Exxon has been working to scale back the legislation and stop Exxon paying more tax. He told us which United States senators the company sought to recruit to their lobbying campaign. And they're not all Republicans.
We're playing defense because President Biden's talking about this big infrastructure package, and he's going to pay for it by increasing corporate taxes. You stick to highways and bridges, then a lot of the negative stuff starts to come out because
for you guys,
because there's a germaneness, right? That doesn't make any sense for a highway bill. Why would you put in a something on emissions reductions on climate change to oil refineries in a highway bill?
Who's the crucial guys for you?
Well, Senator Capito, who's the ranking member on Environment and Public Works, Joe Manchin, I talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker on this because he's a Democrat from West Virginia, which is a very conservative state. And he's not shy about sort of staking his claim early and completely changing the debate. So on the Democrat side, we look for the moderates on these issues. So it's the Manchins, it's the Sinemas, it's the Testers.
Exxon is even trying to get through to President Biden through his friend, Senator Chris Coons.
It's damning, and there's more of it, and we'll link to the full thing on the show notes for this episode, which you can find on our Patreon page. It's just astounding to me that our leaders plan to do nothing about climate change. The colleagues of Manchin, Sinema, Mark Kelly, Chris Coons should be protesting them in their office because they're sentencing us to die. They're sentencing more species to extinction. This is blood on their hands, all for Exxon. This is not a new problem, certainly, by any means. The longtime former CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson, was, of course, Trump's Secretary of State, which was shocking, which was absolutely not normal. As CEO of Exxon, Tillerson pushed through an Iraqi oil deal that threatened American foreign policy at the time. That was just the tip of the iceberg for Exxon. From the Washington Post, the world's largest oil firm, Exxon has long exercised formidable clout in countries where it does business. The company has not shied away from controversy, inking deals with autocratic governments and speaking out against sanctions, such as those the United States has imposed on Russia that hurt its bottom line. End quote. We certainly saw that with Putin giving Tillerson an Order of Friendship medal. So who was it that pushed for Tillerson to become Trump's Secretary of State? Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Tillerson was their longtime client, paying Rice and Gates for their consulting services. As the saying goes, money, money, money. At the expense of human lives, at the expense of a livable planet, at the expense of our children's future. Republicans, more than the Kremlin, turned America into a struggling democracy like Ukraine, stressed by a losing war against corruption. Republicans held the door open for the Kremlin, and the Kremlin walked right in. They put their free market ideology above national sovereignty, literally selling out our country and its best interests for profit. Condoleezza Rice promoted and endorsed the Exxon CEO to be Secretary of State while promoting her own book on democracy. So what kind of future do we have if we continue down this path of letting Exxon buy public servants, buy endorsements from former major government officials? Putin's Russia paints it out clearly. According to ProPublica from a piece last year, Russia welcomes the warmer planet because the melting ice will make room for more farmland in Russia and open the Arctic up for ships and drilling. Russia is literally already planning to benefit from a warming planet. Their plan is to become an agricultural powerhouse with all this new thawed farmland. Okay, so if you're wondering how Putin and Manchin and these Exxon executives can stand to be on the side of letting our world literally burn, it's because they imagine a future where their precious, sacred, free market ideology will help them continue to thrive. This is known as disaster capitalism. So if Russia becomes an agricultural powerhouse, what will happen to current agricultural powerhouse, California? It may likely be on fire. So the tens of millions of Americans who currently vote for Exxon by voting Republican and for moderate Democrats like Manchin and Sinema, they should be perfectly fine with all this because for them, Fox News is launching a weather service, likely to invent another big lie that a hot, uninhabitable planet is good for you. It will be like Soviet Pravda for the weather. Republican free market ideology is turning America into the Soviet Union. The Reagan Revolution did not defeat the Kremlin. The Reagan Revolution let the Kremlin right in.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that's been disturbing me for a while is that there's this feigned shock, this sort of feigned revelation about so many different issues at once. You know, like, oh, well, we didn't know about climate change, or Exxon didn't know. You know, Exxon knew. There's documents showing that Exxon knew as early as the late 70s, 1980s, and were perfectly fine to let climate change continue, you know, for their own profit margin. They're perfectly fine to collaborate with countries like Russia and to, you know, maximize the profit potential of literally letting the Arctic melt. And this week I saw a lot of that same, you know, feigned astonishment about the Trump organization, founded around the same time, although, you know, under Fred Trump, but I'm talking about with Donald Trump, as having tax fraud, as being a front for a mafia syndicate. Like all of these people are like, oh my gosh, you know, like who could have ever known? Like this was all reported on in real time. You know, there were books and articles written by people like Wayne Barrett or David K. Johnston that covered all of this in real time. It was, in fact, with Trump, so ubiquitous that shows I watched as a child, you know, and I've talked about this before. Like I was watching an episode of the show Erie, Indiana from 1991 with my son. And the entire show was about a guy called the Donald who turned out to be Satan, who worked for the Donald organization. And he tricked all of the residents of Erie, Indiana into selling his souls. And then in the end, who takes him down? The IRS, because the Donald was such an absolutely infamous tax cheat running a fake organization for his personal benefit. Like I was 12 in 1991 when this aired, and I was expected to know enough that, one, the Donald is obviously Donald Trump, and two, Donald Trump is a massive tax cheat who's hunted by the IRS. Like, this is child level knowledge. They had allusions to this on Sesame Street. They had it in all of these shows that 80s and 90s kids watched. So when I see someone like, I think Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic recently said, my goodness, no one could have possibly known about the grift. It's like, oh my God. I mean, it was probably in The Atlantic. It's in the newspapers that Goldberg himself would have written for. It was certainly in all of these books. But the same thing is true of climate change. And there's so many aspects of the corruption now where I look back at the memories of my childhood. And I was like a weird kid. I was a kid who read, more magazines. Like I was a, very voracious reader of magazines and books, kind of abnormally. For a child, I ruined a sleepover party by talking about Iran-Contra. But anyway, one of the things that I'm always like, did I hallucinate this? Is my memory wrong? Was widespread fear, panic, and concern about the environment in the late 80s, early 90s. I remember all my babysitters who would spray their bangs having to switch from aerosol cans to others because they were worried about the ozone layer. I remember losing the McDLT because McDonald's had to switch from styrofoam containers to cardboard containers. I remember this being a common ongoing topic of conversation. I remember mandatory recycling being instituted, and I didn't grow up anywhere fancy or particularly politically conscious. I grew up in the same town that our current Department of Education head, Miguel Cardona, came from Meriden, Connecticut. This is not a place where people were, out, joining Greenpeace or doing anything politically wise, really. But I just remember this. I remember in school having to read a book called 50 Things Kids Could Do to Save the Earth. And so I had to check, did all these things actually happen, or have I somehow retroactively invented them? And it's like, well, yes, that was a bestseller. Yes, this was a huge deal. And I found this little snippet I'm just going to read. This is from an article written in 1989 by scientists at the University of Illinois. And they're talking about this giant change in American political consciousness. And they say, a Gallup poll released after the 1988 presidential election concluded that the environment was the number one concern of the voting public. More surprisingly, the poll indicated that the United States could be capable of electing a president based solely on the candidate's environmental agenda by as early as 1992. If skyrocketing membership rolls in national environmental organizations are any indication, the Gallup poll is right on target. The 5.8 million member National Wildlife Federation, the largest such organization in the United States, added 700,000 new members in 1988 alone. And then, someone goes on to say the public hasn't responded like this since the early 1970s, and then says an annual survey of college freshmen released in February reported that 86% of the over 200,000 students polled said that, quote, the federal government is not doing enough to control pollution. So no, I did not hallucinate this moment in time. This really was a period where people were talking very frankly about climate change. They were talking about what was going to come down the road if they did not act now, what kind of future I, as a child, was going to grow up in. And it's literally what we have right now. It's a giant heat dome over the Pacific Northwest. It's buildings collapsing and bridges breaking under the weight of both shoddy infrastructure and the climate crisis. It's the series of climate disasters that we've endured over the last decade. It's summer after summer of watching temperatures rise. We're here. They did not act. They knew. They did nothing. We are paying the price. But what is just, so appalling to me is, again, this feeling of well, I guess they're going to just let us all die off. I mean, I feel like coronavirus, COVID-19 was the prelude to this. It's let's just let mass death happen, not give people resources, not give people, healthcare, not give people coherent, sensible advice on what they're supposed to do, and see what happens when they all die, and see if there's anybody held accountable for that. Is the COVID committee, which was Kushner, Mnuchin, Ross, Pence, I think Michael Caputo later, Are they going to be held accountable for what they did? Is, are investigations going to happen? Are committees going to be formed? I mean, and honestly, people think of this as a Republican thing, but I think it's completely merited to have an investigation into COVID-19's origins, an investigation into how Fauci handled this crisis. Instead, it is all hands off. We're not touching that. And so then you look at climate and you're like, well, is anyone going to hold Exxon accountable? Is it going to be like what happened to big tobacco, where finally there were changes and there were lawsuits? And as a result, there was a cessation of cigarette smoking rates in the United States. Like, will something like that happen? And the answer is basically like, well, no. And also a sense of it's too late. And, I very much oppose the it's too late thing because we're dealing with levels of catastrophe. And I'd rather be in the more minimal range of the catastrophe than the maximal range. And so there is still plenty of things that our government, our officials, corporations, whoever could be doing to not necessarily turn this around, but to just try to not make it worse, try to mitigate the extent of the damage. That is always something that is worth pursuing. But instead, we have people like Manchin meeting with Exxon. We have people like Sinema collaborating with these corrupt corporations. And again, this is all like one big giant crime. It plays directly into what's happening with voting rights. Last week we saw the Supreme Court basically annihilate what was left of the VRA. This is John Roberts' big agenda. This is, I would say he'd go down in history, but I'm not sure going to live long enough for history. But if we do, this is what he'll go down for.
And John Roberts has had his eye on taking away voting rights or tamping down voting rights since he was a lawyer in the DOJ.
Yeah, John Roberts is terrible. There's like a Eddie Vedder solo song, by the way, from the Into the Wild soundtrack about John Roberts' plan, just for proof.
Right. Yeah. So this is all by design.
This is by design. And so, of course, the Supreme Court goes and does this. And we know, we've been saying all along, along with special guests on Gaslit Nation, like Adam Gentleson, that the solution here is to abolish the filibuster and to pass multiple bills and acts that protect voting rights. And the, designated villains in this regard, although I think there are others in the Senate that don't want to do this either, are Manchin and Sinema, the people who are collaborating with fossil fuel industries. So when people say, well, okay, the way to handle both the climate crisis and these shitty Democrats is vote them out, vote in some responsible leadership, vote in some leadership that's receptive to the demands of the public and that understands the climate crisis that we're currently in. You can't do that when people can't vote. Like, I don't know why this is so hard for people to process, but you're not going to get like a 2020 style election where people are mobilized, they are out in the streets, they are canvassing, and they are able to vote. They are able to, for example, vote by mail. They're able to have, polling places. Like we're going to see a massive drop in the number of polling places, a massive drop in accessibility. And of course, as Ari Berman said when he was on our show recently, one of the newer and worst manifestations of this is the ability of GOP-dominated state legislatures to simply throw out your vote. And so without protections, we will not be able to get out these awful leaders who are literally abandoning us to a burning planet. And so that's why, I kind of kicked this off with like, who does this? Who thinks this way? Elites who truly do not care what happens to this country and what happens to the people living in it. They are allocating their resources. They are, storing up their wealth. And that's it. And it's like, this is an unacceptable situation. This is not me giving up. This is me being very pissed. And like one of the reasons I'm so angry is because people will not call this out for what it is. I think if we don't name it, if we don't define it, if we don't make clear what the stakes are here, then people are less likely to even debate what action to take. Like we are at an impasse. Like I think people don't necessarily know what to do with a crisis that great. And I think that that's kind of understandable. Like it's a lot of different things at once. But in order to have a meaningful debate about what course of action is necessary right now and what we should do to prevent this horrible dystopian future, we need to at least name the present accurately.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to Oil Change International, an advocacy group supported with a generous donation from the Greta Thunberg Foundation that exposes the true costs of fossil fuels and facilitates the ongoing transition to clean energy.
We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. And if you want to confirm the fact that orangutan is pronounced correctly, go to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzie and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. And you can also subscribe to us on YouTube.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher. Megan McNerney,
Sean Rubin,
Ton S. Pearlstein,
Pat,
Kenny Main,
John Schoenthaler,
Frank Jaquette,
Ellen McGirt,
Joel Ferron,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Lex Reed,
Andrea Scalzo,
Melissa Howland,
Jordan Sanders,
Ann Bertino,
Rachel Winder,
T.R. Dunstan,
John Millett,
Chris Ash,
David East,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Chris Fellow,
Dodie Pop,
Kristen Bredimus,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Rich Holcomb,
Thomas Scheibe,
Kelsey Malsom,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Mark,
Matthew Womack,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Tracy Ash,
Benjamin Galuza,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
Irv Robinson,
Keith Gottschalk,
William Barry Reeves,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Sandra Cullmans,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
Jeff Thompson,
James D. Leonard,
Evan Rosemore,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Gulstad,
Michael Woldridge,
Crimer, no criming,
the best, Jason Benke,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
Jeremy Lewis,
Trygve,
Christine M.,
D.L. Singfield,
Nicole Spear,
Brian Tajudin,
Christy Vitale,
Maureen Murphy,
Michelle Dash,
Jans Alstrup Rasmussen,
Dorothy Kamarick,
Victoria Olson,
Alabama,
ZW,
Lisa LaFlame,
Jason Bainbridge,
Catherine Anderson Carina,
Sarah Gray,
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher,
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann,
Jennifer Slavic,
Piet Yitzma,
David Porter,
Kate Cotton,
Kim Mellon,
Leah Campbell,
Lynn Schneider,
Jared Lombardo,
Karen Humphreys,
Giles Bucket,
Irina Guardia,
Eric Kaplan,
Sonia Bogdanovich,
and Tanya Chalupa. Thank you all for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.